On Mother's Day, people look at Mother's Day in so many different ways. Some people are very happy on this day. Some people are very heartbroken on this day. Some see this weekend coming and it brings about a lot of dread. Others make a big deal about the weekend. And there's others just kind of hide from the weekend altogether. Some see it as a great holiday that was born out of the pure intentions to recognize and say thank you to the mothers in our lives. And there are others who say it's just become a holiday that the corporate world is it's a marketing scam to milk as much money out of us as we can. But regardless how you see this holiday or how you feel about it, all of us have been impacted by the mothers, the grandmothers in our lives. For better or for worse, they have had a tremendous impact on us. So on this Mother's Day, I want to talk about mothers, but I want to talk to all of us. I want to talk about mothers, but I'm talking to all of us. And I want you to remember that, just think about this statement as we begin that. Great joy, deep pain. Great joy, deep pain. Now, any good Hallmark card will tell you that there's no love like a mother's love. But the same is true of a mother's pain. If you think about it, Eve was the first mother, and you think about the joy and of the experience of being the first woman to see a child born, how remarkable a miracle that was to her. But she was also the first mother to have to bury a son. And on top of that, it was his brother that killed him. Think of Mary. The joy, the excitement, the wonder, the purpose that was brought to her life because she gave birth to the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who would save the world. No greater joy could have been that to her. But think of the deep pain that when he was arrested and tried and crucified, the pain she felt, the confusion and the loss of direction in her life she must have felt. Great joy, deep pain. A friend of mine, right after his wife gave birth to their child, told me, he said, I found out something today being with Carol in the delivery room. A woman in labor doesn't have a sense of humor. He said, I tried to give some little quick joke while she was in labor pain. She reached up and ripped my shirt. And in motherhood, we think of the pain coming all at the beginning. In labor, but at birth, the pain is forgotten. And to a limited extent, that's very true. But when they hand you that little bundle of joy, the cycle of joy and pain has only begun. It's just the beginning of a life of many ups and downs, and every mom's heart is continually marked by great joy and deep pain. And what I want to do today is just take three women from the Bible and look at their lives. All are mothers. Look at their experience, which leads us to ask ourselves three questions from their experience. And so that's what I want to do. Remember, this is about mothers, but it's to all of us. And the first one is a name many of you have heard of, maybe some of you hadn't. The woman's name was Jochebed. Jochebed. And her story is found in Exodus chapter 2. Verses 1 and 2 says this. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now you notice it doesn't even mention her name, but we learn a few chapters later that her name was Jochebed. And why would when a child is born, do you hide them? No, you would think, what's going on here? That's the greatest joy. You want to tell everybody that you've got a new baby. But she's hiding the baby, and the reason she's doing this is because this is during the time when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. And their population had grown so much that the Pharaoh, the Egyptians, began to get a little afraid that there's so many of them, if we're attacked by another enemy, they may join with them and they'll be able to overpower. So they started to begin to try to control the population. And Pharaoh gave an order. He says, every Hebrew male child that is born must be thrown into the Nile River. In other words, you must kill every Hebrew male child. This is why she's hiding this child. Exodus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says this, but when she could hide him no longer, and that makes sense. You can't hide a child forever. It says, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister, who turns out to be Miriam, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Jochebed had two choices. She could hold on to that child and know eventually the authorities would find out. They would come kill the child anyway, probably kill the whole family for disobeying the Pharaoh. Or she could turn loose. She could let go of her child. And what seemed to be two terrible choices, what seemed to be the worst time that you could ever imagine to give birth to a baby boy, turns out to be the exact time that God said this baby would be born. A couple of years ago, we talked about this, and I'd like to remind us that there are two stories going on continually. There's God's big story, where he's working out his plan all the way to the redemption of mankind in heaven. And there's a little story, and that's where we're at. We live a little story. There's God's big story. And in his story, Moses is going to be born to deliver his people. In our story, Jochebed had to look and go, this couldn't be worse that I'm having to do this. But God's plan, his story is working with our story. And that's what we see here. And what we see happen next is the hand of God. You can't give it anything else. It's the hand of God. Pharaoh's daughter, and I know that Miriam and Jochebed know this, that she would go down to the Nile River, and that's where she would bathe. So that's where they put the baby in the basket. So she would stumble upon it. It says she goes down there, she sees the basket, looks in the basket, and just her heart is touched, and she doesn't want to kill the baby. So on cue, Miriam jumps out and says, hey, you found a baby. You want me to find one of the Hebrew women to take care of it for you? And that's where it goes on in verses 7 through 9. It says, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter doesn't even know this. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Now that's a pretty good deal, isn't it? You have your baby. You find a way to get the Pharaoh's daughter to take care of it, and then they pay you to take care of the baby. Pretty good deal, isn't it, moms? God's working, isn't it? So you just can't beat that deal, but the story doesn't end here because that's just a step in the story. Verse 10 says this, when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses. That second releasing and turning loose had to be just as difficult, if not even more difficult. That's tough on a mom. To say, I brought this child, I gave this child life. And then through the plan I worked out, I saved him again. And I've raised him up to this age, and now he won't even carry my name. He will be known as another woman's son. That was tough. That would be tough for any woman to turn loose, surrender in that case. Missy Robertson, the wife of Jace Robertson of Duck Dynasty fame, told this to her son Reed, who got engaged this past December. She told him this. She says, Reed, I love you with all my heart, but once you say I do this fall, you can't come home. And Brighton, that's the girl he's marrying, you're stuck with him. And she went on to say why she would say this to her son. She revealed that from her background, and on the week that she was going to get married, her father told her this advice. My dad stopped me in the hallway of our house one day, took me by the shoulders, faced me head on, and stated, Missy, I need to tell you something very important. When you get married on Friday, you can't come home. You're not welcome to come back to this house to live after Friday night. When you have problems with your husband, and you will, you'll need to work them out. Your mom and I will be here to help you however we can. but you'll have to go home to your husband. And Missy couldn't understand at that point in her life why her dad would say this, but she said through the years of experience as being married, she understood very quickly the wisdom of his words, because there were times all she wanted to do was run from her problems. But she went home and talked to Jace. It led her to share this wisdom with Reed and Brighton. And listen to this. Now that my oldest son, Reed, has chosen Brighton to be his wife, he needs to love her more than he loves me. And I, as his mom, need to understand that. There's no place in a marriage for a man to love his mother more than he loves his wife. And there's no place in a marriage for a mother who hasn't accepted that. Wow. Now, whether you agree and whether you can take that in right now, whether you agree with those statements or not, you have to understand, you recognize her ability, her commitment to releasing, to turning over to God and to someone else the love and care for her son. And so that just leads us to this question. Where do you need to surrender control? What thing in your life do you need to surrender to God and say, God, I'm holding on too tight. I need to let you handle this. I need to put it in your hands. And it could be 1,000 different things that you might be struggling with. And I can't go through and name all the things that maybe you need to let go of, release, and let God take care of. But the real issue comes down to what one of the Proverbs says. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. You see, it all comes down to trusting God or trusting yourself. Who do you trust more? Do you trust God and his ways, or do you trust your ways? Do you submit to, that's what acknowledge means there. Do you submit to his ways? Jochebed's story isn't a fairy tale, but the story of a woman who trusted God enough to let go, to release into his hands. And that's what we're left with. Will we surrender that area of our lives back to God? There's a second woman I want to talk about today. She doesn't even have a name in the scriptures. Her name is never given. She's just known as the widow of Zarephath. And in 1 Kings 17, it's her story. We're told how the prophet Elijah is a fugitive. He's running for his life because he has said some very unpopular things, and the kings and queens don't like to hear what they don't want to hear. Unless you're telling them how great they are, they don't want to hear it. So they're going to kill Elijah. So he runs and hides. And God tells him to go to the city or the town of Zarephath. And when he gets there at the city gate, he asks a woman, a widow woman, there, will you give me some water and a piece of bread? And this is what she answers back to him in 1 Kings 17, verse 12. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Now that's a pretty grim outlook on life, isn't it? We're going to eat our last meal because there's no hope past that, and we're just going to die. This is truly our last meal. But Elijah tells her to do this. He says, I want you to go and do what you're planning to do, but I want you to first do this. He says, I want you to make a piece of bread. Make the bread, but bring a piece to me first. And he says, and I promise you that God will not let the flour or the oil run out until this drought is over with. And she went and did it. And she went and did that. And it says in the scriptures in 1 Kings, it doesn't tell us how long this went on, but it says for days. Every day she went back to the cupboard and she takes out the jars of oil and the flour, that it's just flour there again. And there's oil there again that never runs out. And this is where it would like to end the story, wouldn't we? But the story doesn't end there. The scripture goes on and tells us that her son got ill and died. And she comes back to Elijah upset with him, upset with God. And Elijah goes to God and prays, says, God, please don't do this to this widow. Give life back to her son. And he does. And he carries the boy back to the woman. And this is what she says in verse 24. She says, then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. You catch that? Now I know. Now I know. You've been watching a miracle every day when you would go to pour the oil out of a jar and get the flour out. You see a miracle every day and you say, now I know. And so it begins to make me think this, that she was obedient even when she had doubts. She was obedient even when she had questions. And so it teaches us that it is possible to be an obedient person, to be an obedient Christian, and still have some doubts. That you're not 100% sure that everything's going to work out. You don't have a question about whether I'm doing the right thing or not. You can still be obedient. You know, moms, you don't have to be able to see the future for your son and daughter. You can have questions about what's going to turn out. But all you got to do is trust God, because he already sees the future. He sees your son and daughter's future. And when we read in the Bible something that we need to do that goes against what our common sense is telling us to do, or what we think is the big story here, like it says, I need to give. I know I need to give. God's told me that. But I don't have enough money to give. But you still give. You didn't give in total 100% assurance, but you gave. When you serve and give your time, you're going, I need that time. But you went. When you forgive because God says forgive, even though you're not sure that's a good idea to forgive this person, to give them a second chance, you're not sure, but you still forgive. You're being obedient. And the list goes on and on that what we can do. I love the story where a father brought his son to Jesus. And he was demon-possessed, and the father said the disciples of Jesus couldn't cast the demon out. And so Jesus sees what's going on, and he goes over, and the man says to Jesus, if you can do anything, please heal my son. And this is what Jesus says back to him in Mark 9:23 and 24. He says, if you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for him who believes. And I love this. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Yeah, I love that. Because that's us. That's us. I do believe. Help me to overcome my unbelief. You ever been there? Ever been there? Are you there now? Feel like you spend your whole life between those two things? But the father did the one essential thing, that he cried out to Jesus, even in his unbelief, even when he knew that his faith wasn't 100% where it needed to be, even when he knew that his life wasn't exactly where it needed to be. So let me ask you this question. Where do you need to be obedient? Where do you need to be obedient? Even when you doubt. When you doubt that if I obey anything, it's going to change. Even if you're afraid to obey. Is there anyone here who has never doubted? Anyone here, let me say this, make sure I get this said. Is there anyone here who has never doubted God, or never doubted that his ways were the best ways? Do you dare raise your hand? I didn't think so. Because every one of us have been to that place where we want to be obedient. And maybe we are obedient, but we still had doubts. That's what we find from this woman. And it's a great question for us. Where do we need to be obedient, even in doubt? Now I want to finish up this morning with one last lady, and that kind of leads us to the ending here. And that's the story of Bathsheba. The story of Bathsheba. I thought about this week. I read this statement. It says, we tend to think more about how she became a mother than motherhood herself. And that's the truth. We stop to even think about her being a mother. We just think about how she became a mother. Because Bathsheba was the woman who had an affair with King David that led to so much scandal. She got pregnant. It led to all kinds of scandal. And then to cover up the scandal, it led to murder, embarrassment, extreme heartache. And if you remember the story, David saw Bathsheba. He walks out on the roof of his palace, looks down into the neighborhood, and sees her bathing on the roof of her house. You know, and these are flat roof houses, and she's there in the cool of the evening, and she's bathing. And he sends word for her to come to the palace. And that's where the affair was born from. The opinions of Bathsheba go from one range spectrum to the other. Some just see her as totally a victim of the king. When the king says, come to the palace, you go to the palace. And others say that no, she knew exactly what she was doing. She wouldn't have been out on the top of her house bathing when she knew David would be out there, luring and seducing him to see her. We don't know. We're not told either way. We don't know how she felt. Did she go along with the plan to have her husband killed in battle? We're not told anything. But after David had her husband Uriah killed in battle, he takes her as his wife, and thinking this will cover up all of the sin and no one will know. But you've got to know some people knew, because he had told someone in battle, his commander-in-chief said, make sure he dies in battle. You know, the servants in the house had to know something. But from king on down, we always think that we're hiding everything, don't we? Nobody can figure it out. This was years ago. I know I've told some of you this before, but many years ago. And if you tell Janice's mom this, I'll tell her y'all are lying. She used to smoke. She used to smoke, but she didn't think anybody knew it. And I love people like that. She didn't think anybody knew, and she was going to have surgery. And so we're up there in Virginia Beach, and the anesthesiologist comes in, and she's laying there on the bed, and he's looking. He says, Miss Casada, I see that you're a smoker. And I went, oh! Like that. And she looked at me. She could have killed me right then. So from then on, the cat was out of the bag. She couldn't hide it anymore. But we all think that we've got this thing hidden. God sends the prophet Nathan to confront David with his sin. Even though there's some people probably already knew, David didn't think anyone knew. And so Nathan comes and points out his sin. David repents, turns back to God, but the baby dies. The baby dies. And what looks like is the final twist in a very sordid story that's heading towards a terrible ending, a tragedy from beginning to looks like the end. It's not. It's not the end. Because if you'll read there in 2 Samuel, just a few verses later, it says this, that Bathsheba became pregnant again. His wife became pregnant. It says she has a child. Turns out to be a son. Turns out that they give him the name Solomon. The same Solomon that became king of Israel, probably the second greatest well-known king of all of Israel, Solomon. And it turns out that this is the family line that Jesus is born from. So Bathsheba is a blood relative to Jesus. Now, we don't know how Bathsheba responds to any of this. We're not told anything from beginning to end what her thoughts and feelings are. It would be good reading, wouldn't it? Maybe that's an appointment we can make in heaven, just to sit down with Bathsheba and say, tell us the whole story. What were you thinking and feeling? We're not told, but we do learn this. More important, we learn this. We learn how God reacts in a story like this. We learn that God is still working in a story that looks like it has a terrible ending, that's going off the side of a cliff. But God hasn't stopped working. God's grace is still at work. Now, as we're thinking about this right now, all of us have got some dark tales to tell. All of us have got some skeletons in the closet. We may be the skeleton in the closet for our family. But God's not finished. God's not finished. And a story like Bathsheba's is one that gives us hope that our story doesn't have to end so terribly bad. And so here's the third question for the day. Are you part of a story that needs redeeming? A story that needs a new ending? A story that looks hopeless, but you don't want it to be hopeless? Does it feel like you've gone too far, it's too embarrassing, too many mistakes? What we need to know is that God doesn't give up. And God's not giving up on you or me or anybody's sordid story. 3 stories, 3 women, 3 questions. I can't help but believe that out of these 3, every one of us can't find something that we know we need to do. And this is a part of the service that we call our time of decision. Because we've come to the end of this worship service and we've come to the end of the time where we're studying His Word, and it's time to decide. What are you going to do with it? Now, not everything's a public decision, but if it is one today for you, this is the place, this is the time to decide, to surrender, to trust, to say to God, I want a new story, and begin it today.